Welcome everyone to the third of our four-part educational series, Virginia Preservation Academy. I'm Elizabeth Castelny, CEO of Preservation Virginia. And on behalf of our Board of Trustees and statewide staff, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. We're grateful to the Department of Historic Resources for helping to organize and fund this series, and to the department's leadership in preserving the Commonwealth's history year-round. Thanks also goes to our panel of experts for what promises to be an educational and engaging program. I especially want to thank Sonia Ingram, Preservation Virginia's Associate Director of Preservation Field Services, for envisioning this series as a way to explore the fundamentals of preservation best practices. The Virginia Preservation Academy features live lectures by preservation professionals with direct interaction between participants and panelists. Recordings of the webinars will serve as a foundation for a library of training videos and will be available on the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and Preservation Virginia's websites. You may also be interested in another new tool for Virginia's historic preservation community. The Virginia Historic Preservation Network is a web-based platform for questions and collaboration. It's a place to share information, ideas, and events about history and historic preservation. The link to join the Preservation Network will be posted in the chat. We're grateful to the following sponsors who not only supported this program, but also support our advocacy during the General Assembly session. These sponsors include Rick Barker Properties, Monument Construction, Historic Richmond, Linden Capital, National Trust Insurance Services, Glavan Homes, Piedmont Environmental Council, Hirschler, Commonwealth Preservation Group, Jenny Keller, and Trip Pollard. A few bits of housekeeping. We welcome your questions during the discussion, but we'll be saving those questions to the end when our moderator will pose them to the panelists. But you can ask them at any time by entering them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Preservation Virginia is offering certification maintenance credits provided, and we're a provider for the American Institute of Certified Planners. This program and the next program in the series are available for AICP certification. Those credits are 1.5, and they're eligible. Their instructions will be put into the chat if you need to have those credits. Preservation Virginia recently revised our strategic plan with an aim of inspiring and engaging the public to foster, support, and sustain Virginia's historic places. By valuing and prioritizing knowledge and innovation, inclusion and diversity, sustainable stewardship and integrity, we seek to collaborate with individuals and organizations to foster a more complete understanding of the people and places and events of the history of the Commonwealth, and to make those connections for our communities today and into the future. The Virginia Preservation Academy is one example of how Preservation Virginia is seeking to expand networks and support local capacity building to sustain Virginia's historic places. The series will conclude next week on April 6th, and the topic that evening will be how to choose a preservation consultant, how to find them, and how to hire them. So be sure to join us for what promises to be an interesting discussion. But tonight's presentation is one that I've eagerly awaited. Where do you begin when you want to learn more about a historic structure? It's probably the most frequently asked question of our staff. And to get us started, I want to welcome Julie Langen, Director of the Department of Historic Resources and our State Historic Preservation Officer. Julie was appointed to her position in 2014 as the director after serving as the deputy director and several other positions at DHR. So she knows that agency very well. She has brought her expertise, talent, leadership, and passion for historic places to local organizations, nonprofits, and governmental agencies. And it's my honor to introduce Julie.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Tonight's topic is one that I also receive a lot of inquiry about, as does the staff at DHR. So I'm really excited about tonight's topic as well as tonight's speakers. But first, I just want to say a word about the partnership that the Department of Historic Resources enjoys with Preservation Virginia. I hope everybody watching tonight knows that we have a very collaborative partnership. We have no stronger or better partner than Preservation Virginia. And I need to give credit where credit's due. This Preservation Academy was not DHR's idea, but it was Preservation Virginia's. And they came to us with a really wonderful idea that we were happy to support. Tonight's program includes a couple of cultural resource experts who are top in their field, and I'm not going to embarrass them by saying for how many decades we've been acquainted and worked together, but there are no better people to learn from than Maral, Kalbian, and John Salmon. So it's really great to see you virtually this evening. But before you hear from them, I would like to introduce the moderator for tonight's program, Karice Luck-Brimmer. And Karice wears a couple of different hats. Most of the time, she works as the Community Initiatives Program Associate with Virginia Humanities. And in that capacity, she's working on cultural heritage projects in Southern Virginia. And she works with the African American Task Force that was established by the General Assembly. But in addition to that, she serves on the Board of Historic Resources. And for those of you familiar with that board, that tells you that she was appointed by a governor to serve in that capacity. She reviews nominations to the Virginia Landmarks Register, highway markers, and deals with our easement program. And she, in her spare time, I don't know that she has a lot of it. She's very active in preservation matters in her hometown of Danville. So it's a pleasure for me to be with you this evening. And I wish I could be with you at the very end for questions, but I have another webinar at 7. So if there are any questions that someone from DHR really should answer, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email, phone call, and I'd be happy to follow up with you. So thanks very much, and I'll turn it over to Karice.
Good evening. I bring you greetings from Danville, Virginia, and it is my pleasure to be with you all today and to introduce our wonderful panelists that will be giving you tips and techniques on how to research historic sites. Today, we will be joined by panelists Maral, Kalbian, John Salmon, and Dr. Angelita Reyes. Maral Kalbian is an architectural historian and historic preservation specialist who has practiced in the Shenandoah Valley and Piedmont of Virginia for 35 years. Maral's company, Maral S. Kalbian, LLC, provides historic architecture research and documentation to a variety of public and private clients, including several local governments. Some of Ms. Kalbian's publications include Frederick County History Through Architecture, African American Historic Context of Clark County, Virginia, Destination Middleburg, A Walking Tour into the Past, and Clark County, Virginia, Images of America. Ms. Kalbian has lectured extensively on topics related to historic preservation throughout and has earned numerous honorary and professional awards for her work. She has served on Preservation Virginia's board since 2018. John S. Salmon, as an archivist between the years of 1972 and 1987 at the Library of Virginia, compiled guides to state records. At the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, he was the historian and state architectural highway marker manager. He surveyed Virginia battlegrounds for the Civil War Sites Advisory Commission and wrote the Virginia Civil War Battlefield Guide of the state's battlefields. He was the staff's historian for the Tredegar National Civil War Center Foundation, helping to create this National Civil War Museum and Learning Center. Since 2004, he has worked as an independent consultant. He has written and edited marker and brochure text for Virginia Civil War Trails, a nonprofit educational corporation, and he has also written more than 70 National Register of Historic Places nominations, and has written edited theme studies for the National Park Service and other organizations. Dr. Angelita Reyes is the founding director of Literary Interactives, Inc. Reyes earned her doctorate from the University of Iowa in comparative literature and anthropology. An award-winning author, teacher, and education consultant, Reyes is a distinct voice in today's national and global arena of new approaches for social and organizational transformation. She began primary and field research on vernacular architecture and material culture in Southern Virginia that produced the Patrick Robert Parker Sidnor Historic Log Cabin Site as a community and regional civic and public history project. The history site is now listed on the prestigious National Register of Historic Places and the Virginia National Register. And now I will turn this over to Maral Kalbian and John Salmon, who will start with our first presentation.
All right, I think now we're set. We're down at the end of the slides. All right, so where to begin is the question of the moment when you're starting to do research on historic sites. And the purpose of doing the research we'll be discussing is to enable you to understand which records are most valuable if you want to write a National Register nomination or simply learn more about a property. The amount of detail needed for a nomination largely depends on which criteria or criterion property is nominated under. Usually it takes two people to write a nomination: an architectural historian for Section 7, the architectural description, and a historian or someone who can conduct the necessary research to write Section 8, the historic context. To help build and organize the historic context, ask yourself some questions. When was the building constructed and for whom? How can you find out about that person's life? What was happening in Virginia and American history then? Was there a significant event such as the Civil War battle on or near the property? Is the building a farmhouse, an urban dwelling, or a commercial building? What's important to understand about it? You can find answers to these questions in primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources include original records such as deeds, wills, lawsuits, letters, diaries, vital records or birth, marriage and death records, church records, land and personal property tax books, military service records, census records of inhabitants, enslaved people, and agricultural products, historic photographs and sketches, and contemporary maps. Many county records dating up to the late 19th century can be found on microfilm at the Library of Virginia. You go on the website and check LVA's online catalog, and you can borrow them via your local library on interlibrary loan. Secondary sources, of course, include national, state, and local histories, books and articles, hopefully based on primary sources, of course. To identify previous owners, use will, deed, and land tax books, which we'll be getting into shortly. Consider what the physical condition of the building can tell you about it, and Maral has some pointers on this subject.
I'll talk about those later, but that's an important point, is to really examine the building and let its condition and the fabric of the building tell you about the building. And I'll explain a little bit more later.
Okay. All righty. Can we have the next slide, please? All right. Up at the top is DHR's web address. And for guidance on how to do research like this, get the two booklets that are shown on the screen. Go to DHR's website, click on reports and publications on the left side of the first page, and then scroll down a little bit to research and guidance publications, and click on these two titles. You can download PDF files for free. The first one lists an enormous number of useful records, more than we have time to discuss here. And the second is a very comprehensive illustrated guide to architectural styles and forms and the jargon that historic architectural historians use. And to construct the historic context, I recommend starting with books like histories and genealogies. This is to avoid reinventing the wheel with regard to your research, because others may have done at least some of the work for you. A handy way to find books in libraries near you is to check online at worldcat.org and search by a title or author. If the book isn't available locally, you can have your library order it from other places on interlibrary loan. Also, some out of copyright books may have been scanned and posted online. So search the internet for titles and authors to see what comes up. It's better to spend time online than to spend it driving around. Architectural histories are the products of careful surveys of counties and cities by qualified architectural historians. They definitely are worth examining, not just in hopes that your particular building has been surveyed, but for relevant examples to compare yours to. National Register of Historic Places nomination forms are another useful source to consult. Visit historic registers on the DHR website and look at recent nominations in the county or city where your subject is located to find properties that resemble yours for comparison. You can also consider branching out to other localities to find properties similar to yours as well. Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act mandates that federally funded or permitted projects like highway construction must first undertake a study of the project area to see if it contains any historic or archaeological resources potentially eligible for listing in the National Register. These studies generate reports that contain information about local history and resources that could be relevant to your property, even if it's outside the project area. Similar information can be found in local historic resource surveys that DHR funds that are published in a small run of government reports. Both types of reports, historic resource and Section 106, are available at DHR. Some may also be found at local libraries or even online occasionally, so check the internet too. You can visit the DHR archives in person and check the website for their days they're open and the hours. Or subscribe to VCRIS to examine architectural survey files that may include the property that you're researching. DHR really should be one of your first stops when you begin researching the property. And Maral is going to discuss VCRIS right now because she's used it and I haven't. I live just a few minutes away from DHR, so I just go down there when I need something.
Well, yeah, thank you. VCRIS has a query function, which is really helpful. So let's say you are writing a nomination about an African-American school, for example. You can search by that and see what has been surveyed and listed throughout the Commonwealth. And that helps with the historic context of where your building fits in. And also with VCRIS, you can search the archaeology reports and archaeological information, because they often have a lot of good historical information. And so when John was talking about the architectural files at DHR, don't forget the archaeological files also. But VCRIS, their search function is very helpful, and you can download it as a spreadsheet, and then you can look up, you can sort it by date and type and locality, and that can help you narrow your scope, and then you can look at those specific things. That's all.
Okay. Local archives is noted on the slide in front of you. City and county libraries sometimes have local history rooms or archives or files on local history subjects that aren't available anywhere else. So check the library's websites and call or email to find out before you go. State, private, and federal archives are also worth examining. All kinds of research resources can be found in Richmond, for instance, at the Library of Virginia, Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and the Valentine Museum. Federal archives include, of course, the Library of Congress and the National Archives and Records Administration of Washington and Maryland. All of these places offer online research, catalogs, digital collections online, and so on. So try those sources before visiting in person. If you do plan to go yourself, email or call first to ask for assistance to save time. The people who work in these places can be incredibly helpful. And don't forget university and college libraries might be around or available with regard to the locality that you're researching. They often have large collections of local personal papers, business records, photographs, and so on. And again, check online first and call them or email for assistance. I've mentioned the internet several times because it's so useful. Search or Google for terms and names related to your subject, your topic. You might find online books, articles, manuscripts, photos. You just never know. So it's always worth doing a search on the internet for your subject. Regarding deeds and chains of title, the deeds are especially helpful because they give you the name of the property owner, description of the property, the legal boundaries. Sometimes local landmarks are mentioned, date of purchase, price, date of purchase, and the recording of the deed, and the price, the names of neighbors, and who the current owner bought it from. So all of that will help you create a chain of title or ownership over time. Grantee and grantor indexes are available on paper at the courthouses, but also digitally online through the government websites in Virginia for the various counties and cities, but not the deeds themselves. And for that, to get the deeds, instead of, you could visit courthouses or go to the Library of Virginia to scroll through microfilm, or you can subscribe to a remote service for courthouse records research. And Maral, again, has experience with that. So she's going to give you a few words on that subject.
Thanks. Yeah, these are things that I think were set up for title companies so that they could do a lot of their work remotely. And most of the localities have scanned and digitized their deed books and will books. And if you're doing a lot of work in a certain area, I suggest that you consider getting a subscription to the remote service. They can be, up to $500 a year, but you can also do it for just a month or something like that, a shorter period of time. And it'll just save you time. And for many people, time is money. So it's a good thing to consider doing.
Okay. Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, these are indexes to will books in a courthouse records room. And another good source for information about real estate and personal property as well are wills, of course. If a tract of land was bequeathed to an heir, there would be no deed. It would be in the will. So, you need to see the will books and examine the wills closely. Although the change of ownership would be noted in the land tax books. We have the next slide. All of the counties have indexes to their deeds. This is just one paper example in Loudoun County. And it shows grantors and grantees alphabetically by surname and by groups of given names. Now the next slide. Okay, land tax records. These are especially valuable but often underutilized sources for researchers. County and city tax assessors evaluated properties and recorded the information in books. One copy went to the courthouse and another was sent to the state auditor of public accounts in Richmond. The auditor's copies eventually were transferred to the state archives at the Library of Virginia, and they date from 1782 to the present. The volumes from 1782 to 1900 are available on microfilm for interlibrary loan. Unfortunately, in some county courthouses, the courthouse copies have been discarded over time to make room for more records. They were seen as not being all that important. So to save space, some of them were thrown out. So the best source to check for them really is the Library of Virginia. For the period from 1782 to 1819, the columns in the books list, among other things, the name of each taxpayer, the number of acres in each parcel, the value per acre, total value of each parcel, amount of tax, nearby landmarks, distance and bearing from the courthouse, and remarks. And properties are reassessed every few years. From 1820 to the present, the columns include all of that, plus a column for the value added to the assessment on account of buildings. We can have the next slide, please. Yeah, these are some 18th and 19th, or sorry, 19th and 20th century land tax books in a courthouse. And we can have the next slide. This is what we're going to see here are three shots as I talk about them across the page of the 1880 Clark County land tax book. And I'm going to discuss the record for Edward Clayton up here on the first line, and on lines 5 through 7, R.H. Delaney. Line 1 tells us that just an example of some of the information you get out of these books. Line 1 tells us that Mr. Clayton is an African American. If you see over by the word Edwards in parentheses what looks like the word cold, it's actually an abbreviation for colored, which was the term used back then. Next to Mr. Delaney's name, you don't see anything. And that's by omission, that tells us that he is white. Go to the next slide, please. All right, on the top line, we see over on the left the word fee. That means Mr. Clayton owned his land in fee simple or outright rather than as a life tenant, which is something, life would be the word there, that you often find for a widow who has been granted residency for her lifetime and then will pass to her children on her death. Mr. Clayton owned 4 acres, and it was adjacent to a place called Chapel Green, and that was south of the courthouse 5 miles. His land was valued at $45 an acre, and the value added on account of buildings on the far right is $100, which we often say is his house was worth $100. although it's really the value of all the buildings on the tract, which could include barn, chicken coop, whatever. The house is always the most valuable building, though. You have the next slide, please. All right, the total value of the land and buildings was $180, and he paid 90 cents in taxes for the year. Now, the really great part is this line here where it says $100 added for buildings. In other words, the $100 value on account of buildings was added this year, 1880, which means that the buildings had recently been constructed. Sometimes it'll say $100 added for new construction, or $50 off for demolition or fire or something like that. So that's the kind of information you can get there. So in this case, we can say that the house most likely was built in 1879 or 80. Now let's go back 2 slides. Oh, one more, there we go. Now we're going to look at Mr. Delaney's 3 tracts, which are lines 5 through 7. And go to the next slide, please. Okay, we see that Mr. Delaney's 3 parcels are for 275 and 60 acres. They probably all adjoined each other, and they're all near Salem Church, 6 miles southwest of the courthouse. The 200-acre parcel includes buildings valued at, excuse me, $300 over in the far right column. The 75-acre parcel has no buildings worth anything, and the 60-acre parcel has $25 worth of buildings. This suggests that the 200-acre parcel is the home place with Mr. Delaney's house. The 75-acre parcel has no houses or other buildings, maybe it's fields, pasture, or woods. And the 60-acre parcel has what might be maybe a tenant house because of the low value, or maybe just a collection of farm buildings or outbuildings, that sort of thing. And the next slide, please. The last thing to observe is that in the remarks column where we had $100 added for buildings, it's blank for these tracts, Mr. Delaney, suggesting that none of the buildings there were new. So if you're tracing Mr. Delaney's buildings to back to their construction date, you need to keep going back in time, looking at the tax books to see. Eventually you might come up with the date, the year that the value was added on account of buildings. Okay, now I'm going to turn this all back over to Maral. She's going to go on with discussing other records.
Thank you, John. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about some other resources that I use. And the Chancery Records are sort of a new source that's readily available in the sense that many of these have been digitized and are on the State Library's website, and they can be searched. They've been scanned. It's a wonderful program, the Virginia Circuit Court Records preservation program, where localities can apply to have, deed books, will books fixed, and then also to have chancery cases scanned. So if you do Google Chancery Records Virginia, it will get you to this site, and you can see there are different ways that you can search. The localities are listed. Some localities, they will just have a list of the cases, but others, the whole file will be included in there. It will have been scanned, and you can search by name. You can search by the year of the case. So if you found information somewhere else, you can use that information. And then also you'll see under surnames, it says case references enslaved persons. So if you check that, that will have that case, or the cases that come up will have information about enslaved persons. And chancery cases are they're cases that aren't readily decided by existing law and usually decided by a judge, and most often address estate and business disputes, debts, divorce. But the wonderful thing about them is that they rely heavily on testimony from witnesses. So you get a lot of firsthand information with a lot of detail, and you can go to the next slide. So here I had just searched under Loudoun County and for different names, and you get something like this. And if you click on view details, next, it'll give you the file, and then you see this manila envelope, and you can just sort of, you can download it, and then you just have to go through page by page. And some of these are hundreds and hundreds of pages, others, are maybe 20 pages. But you'll find things like, newspaper clippings that advertise the Chancery case. Like, for example, here in 1888, next. And then, very often you will find, so this is the Chancery case where it tells you some of the surnames on the left. And like you said, see the halfway in that screen where it says download the zip file of the entire case. You can do that, or open it in full view. And then very often with these pages, it'll tell you go to the next plat. They have bookmarked where plats are, and you can find amazing information on that. But for example, here, if you look down, it talks about at the bottom, it talks about this public sale. Again, a lot of this has to do, with property, and it talks about a comfortable log house. And this all helps you weave the story together of a property that you might be researching. Next. The other thing, because Chancery cases deal with property, there will be information about enslaved persons. And here we have on the right side from 1830, a list of slaves that had been hired out and the fees that were collected for them. And you see it gives their names. And as we all know, it's very difficult to find information about enslaved persons in doing research. And if you don't have a will book where slaves are mentioned by name, or journals or a letter, it's very difficult to put names to these people. And this is a good source that's worthwhile looking for. Next. So the census records that are available online, I'm sure we're all familiar with these. One I didn't put on there is Family Search, which is quickly becoming my favorite one to search because it has so many other things that, personal property records for some localities. They just have a lot of information. They're constantly putting information on their ancestry. Of course, has family trees that other people have created, so you can, tie in with what someone else has done. And a lot of these are available free if you go to a place to research, a library, for example, or a historical association. Or you can, if you have to subscribe to them, it's really well worth it. So the census records, there's the population schedule that we all know about, but then there are slave schedules that are for 1850 and 1860 that are arranged by the enslaver's name, and it'll tell you, and I'll show you here in a minute, the number of slaves that were held. And then the agricultural schedule is a really wonderful source that tells you how a property was used. It'll tell you how many acres were in woods, how many were under cultivation, what they grew, how many beehives they had, how many eggs they produced that year. I mean, stuff that if you really want to fluff up your nomination, you can get, pardon the pun, you can get some really good information from there. And then the industrial schedules, there's some from 1820 and then 1850, 60, and 70, and those are really helpful if you're researching a mill or something that was used in an industrial component. Next. So here, how this is an 1860 census, and we're looking at Otway McCormick, who lived in Clark County, and he owned a farm, and he was 63, and he's a male, And then it tells you the people in his house. And it was in 1850 that they started naming, you know, the other people, but the African-American enslaved are not mentioned in this list. Next, you'd have to look in the slave schedule. So again, you search it by the name of the owner, and then you see that Otway McCormick over on the left had 14 slaves, and it tells you their ages, their sex, and whether they were Black or mulatto. Next. So mutual assurance policies. These are another great tool for buildings that are available. There's the index at the Virginia State Library, and they're arranged by county and town. You can go see the real thing there, but their policies, they provide site plans, building configurations, name of owner, the value of the buildings. So you go to the next slide. Also, there's a link at the Library of Virginia for Mary Washington years ago did this index of mutual assurance maps. So what you do is if you're looking, you know, for someone, you can put in their name and their county or the city. And sometimes I just search by county and I get the whole list of people and then find the people that I'm looking for. Again, this goes back to what John was talking about, that knowing, you know, who owned the property when is really the foundation of doing all this other research. And then when you find that, they just have like these little coded things that tell you the policy number, and then you go find the policy. I suggest you do that. And again, copies at Library of Virginia or DHR. Next. And sometimes, very often, they will have these wonderful magical drawings of buildings that tell you how many stories there are, what the roof was covered in, what the walls were built of. And you know, here we have the wooden dwelling that was 2 stories, a stone smokehouse, which has that wonderful pyramidal roof, and then a wooden kitchen. Next. Maps are another great resource. And they can tell you just so much. And, you know, the thing is, if your building is shown there, you know, it was there at a certain time. And sometimes if you're not certain exactly when something was built, if the land tax records didn't show it, didn't help you, these are really helpful to look at. Next. So this is a 1809 map by Charles Varley, and it's just great because it shows you the road patterns at that time in 1809. This is northwestern Virginia, so it's really kind of, there aren't a lot of roads, although it's surprising how many are shown. These things that look like little spokey wheels are the location of mills. The little things that look like it's a circle with a little flag on top, those are taverns. And then you see they're even, you know, they're showing you the building. And very often it's surprising how much the buildings look like that. I cut off the part of the building that, or the part of the map that shows this one property that had these 2 side wings. We weren't certain of it, and it shows up on the map. So next. Civil War maps. And these are all available Library of Congress. You can just go to the Library of Congress website and search maps for a locality, and they'll show you so many. They'll show you the Civil War maps. They'll show you that are available, you know, historical maps, and also, you know, ones that have to do with industry and all sorts of things. And here, this is a Balls Bluff in Loudoun County, and you can see it points to houses and sometimes names of owners of houses. So those are really worthwhile looking at. Next. The Sanborn maps, these are fire insurance maps. Unfortunately, they're just mainly for urban areas, but they are a great resource. They started in the 1870s, and the colors refer to the different materials, like blue is masonry, it can be stone or concrete, and pink is brick, and yellow is frame, but it tells you how many stories they were, the location of windows. There's a key to these, like what the little circles mean. It tells you what kind of roof it is. And this can really help you understand, you know, the evolution of a building, when additions were made, if it appears on one map and but it wasn't on an earlier map, you know that it wasn't there by that time. So, and it tells you also what they functioned as whether they were dwellings or offices. The D period is dwelling, and C period is usually commercial building. Next. Aerial maps. These are now also readily available going back to the 1930s, the Department of Agricultural maps. That's what one of these is. And if they're very well scanned, you can zoom in and you can actually see buildings. And I use these all the time and when I can get my hands on them. And they're really interesting just to see the pattern of the fields. You know, this is great for rural areas, the road patterns, all that information. Next. So other sources, there are oral histories, which we'll hear more about later, city directories, pictorial histories, building permits. I'm a huge fan of building permits. And very often the counties have not yet thrown them away, but many have thrown the old ones away. I'll show you what some of these are next. Oh yeah, so newspapers. Now, you know, if you part of Ancestry, you can search on newspapers.com, and then of course there's the Chronicling of America through the Library of Congress and the Chronicling of Virginia. You can search by specific newspaper, specific states, and search people's names or things about it. So here's an example. You know, if you're searching about a mill, it tells you a lot about, or more than you would have, or from a different source about a mill. Next. Newspapers also provide fascinating information about what was going on with enslaved peoples. And this is an example from 1860 about the public hiring of, they called them servants, as part of Mrs. Page's estate. And this I was using, I worked on a nomination, and this really added a lot more depth to the nomination and the context about the property and the people who lived there. Next. Old phone books. Yes, those are great. I have many of them because they have these little ads thrown in that will tell you about a building maybe you didn't know in, you know, the 1970s, that something was used as a convalescent home, but you might find it there. But city directories, a lot of these are available online through Ancestry. Charlottesville, for example, and has a lot of those, and you can search, you know, you find the name and it'll tell you what the person did, where they lived. So there's a lot of good information in those. Next. Postcards. Yes, I'm a huge fan of postcards. This shows the George Washington Hotel in Winchester. Here's an earlier postcard. You can see the differences here. Boo, we're getting car sick doing that. Okay, you can see that once upon a time, if you go back to this one, this is good. There were stairs that went up on the side of the building, and it didn't extend fully to the buildings next to it. Go to the slide previous, please. Previous. Yeah, you can see by this time they had turned it, gotten rid of those stairs, that actually put in a Howard Johnson's in the basement. You can read Howard Johnson, and they had extended the building. This was really helpful with the tax credit project that I worked on, and a National Register nomination. Okay, next. Next, yeah. Brochures, finding things on eBay. It's worth, you know, if you have a public building or big commercial building, it's amazing what's out there that, you know, can provide you information. This was great for providing interior views that we would otherwise not have had. And down there, there's the Howard Johnson in the middle. Okay, next. Architectural histories. Yeah, this is, John talked about this early on, and it's really important to know some sort of knowledge of architectural styles so you can speak about it. And that book by DHR that's been completed by the staff that you can download is just great. But you also need, to look at the local vernacular. So look for architectural histories, nominations that have already been done so that you're not recreating the wheel, and you can, find out more about it. Next. For example, this building, it says 1810 on it. It was not 1810. When the research was completed, it was 1840. So buildings sometimes lie to you. Don't believe everything you read. Go next. You've got to do the research. This is a mansard roof on a Greek Revival building. That doesn't make sense. That wouldn't have originally been there. So it tells you about the evolution of the building. Next. Stone foundations, they're used well into the 20th century. Formed concrete, you've got to know when different things were used. Next. Where the placement of chimneys, the type of roofs, the steepness of the roofs tells you a lot about the age of a building. Next. Very often porches would be replaced. Here we have a federal style house with a colonial revival porch. You can see the door was also changed at the same time. So again, let the building speak to you. Next. And lastly, if you really want the building to speak to you, there are things that you can do that are just great. Dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating. And what they do is you find a piece of wood or pieces of wood timbers in the floor joists, ceiling joists, attic that has a waney edge on it, which is a bark edge, which shows that that was the last year it grew. And there are these dendrochronologists that can take samples and then they take them back to their labs and they can date to within 3 months when the trees were felled. So what takes you hours and hours to do research, these guys can do in a fairly short time. And but it's a fascinating sort of new scientific way to approach buildings. And then also looking at things like nail chronology and things like that. Next. So I hope what this has shown you, what John and I have shown you, that you really need a lot of time to do this and paperwork, and you just research, try to be organized so that you can things make a lot of sense. And then really a lot of it is luck. I have found sometimes you find a mother lode of information and other times you strike out a little bit, but keep going because you'll find out the information you need for a nomination. Thank you. Oh, yes, excuse me. Now we will hear from our next panelist, Dr. Angelita Reyes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So I am very excited to share with you a process that I went through for a nomination, a successful nomination to be listed on the National Register. So we're going to start out with a metaphor: storytelling at the kitchen table, preparing a National Register nomination with non-traditional archives. And here's a quote I have from Making History Matter, talking about metaphors as devices to share a complex concept in new ways. So I'm using the kitchen table, storytelling at the kitchen table, as a kind of metaphor. We're always surrounded by interesting stories, and many times these stories start at the kitchen table. Think about it. Family gatherings or just hanging out at the kitchen. The table is seen as a metaphorical safe space for storytelling. But these spaces are often gender-oriented by women, and African-American women in particular. So the table is a safe space and a place. The stories then become narratives of fact, truth, fiction. We spread our documents out on the kitchen table. Our laptops find new comfortable spaces on the kitchen table. And so in summary, I'm moving this forward as an idea for using non-traditional resources for the process of the national nomination. Next slide, please. So the site is the Parker-Sydnor Historic Site located in Mecklenburg County. It has a successful nomination for the National Register of Historic Places, the Virginia Landmarks Register, and in 2012, it has a Virginia Historical Highway marker. The site has a 165-year-old standing log cabin, as you can see in the photo here, and it is in bad shape. It is deteriorating because people no longer live here. But let's move forward and see what we're doing here. Next slide, please. So the site is named after Parker Sydnor, who was born enslaved on the William Sydnor plantation in Halifax County. The significant person at this site is Parker Sydnor. In 1870, the first census to enumerate newly freed African-American women and men, he was designated as literate. So he's among the 18% of African-Americans who were literate at that time. He is also a land-owning farmer, and he is a stone mason. He is a tombstone maker, and he begins to become a tombstone maker all his life. So the nomination becomes a process of not only the structure, the log cabin, but who was that significant person who lived there? The Virginia Department of Historic Resources writes, Sydnor is a known African-American carver with an associated and locally cited body of tombstone work, which is very important. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, moving right into this process of using non-traditional documents, sources, I found a flyer, what we would call, in the olden days, we would call a flyer, that Parker Sydnor made for his business. By this time in 1946, he has been in business for 40 years. And as you can say, tombstones, grave markers, prices are reasonable, Parker Sydnor, Scottsburg, Virginia. Then we have another, maybe more traditional document, a typed letter from the mayor of Scottsburg, Virginia at that time, who is writing to the reporter of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, who did an article on Parker Sydnor that was printed in the newspaper in 1946. So this mayor is thanking the reporter for going down to Scottsburg, thanking him for doing this article on quote unquote Uncle Parker Sydnor. And this article really made Sydnor famous because many newspapers in Southern Virginia picked up the article. They featured him, and he got more work, not only in Mecklenburg County and Halifax County, but also in Lunenburg County. So this is documenting the significance of this individual and his profession. Next slide, please. This is a traditional document that's very important, and many times in the African-American context, we do not find death certificates. Parker Sydnor died in 1950, so by that time, death certificates are pretty much being issued, even in the rural areas. So this has important vital information, family members, the date of his passing. He was ill, he was senile, bronchial pneumonia, but all of this important information that is going to collaborate other pieces of information that we found. Next slide, please. Preparing the nomination for the National Register. We have the what, and then we're moving into the how and the why. I was very pleased that John and Maral went through this information, traditional information, because I started with the title search of the property. I did the title search using all of the resources that they have already mentioned, and I took the property back to 1789. By the way, well, I'll hold this information just for a moment. 1789, a part of Crestwood Plantation. But then when we move into this process, how are we going to, this is a slave cabin. There are no architects. There are no architects. The architects of a slave cabin are the enslaved people themselves. So we're looking for the identities of people who lived there. We're going into funeral home records, cemeteries, photographs, the family Bible, letters, African-American newspapers, and we move into oral histories, which I will elaborate on as well. Why? Why is this significant, this humble dwelling, this humble structure, a cabin where poor people lived in? Well, we're looking at new approaches to historic preservation. Historic sites can now be tools for diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. The significance of Parker Sidnor, he was literate at a time when at least 86% of African Americans were non-literate. We have this inclusion now of vernacular architecture to create this sense of place. This is in a rural historic site, a rural area, a historic site in a rural area. Will people come to this site? Yes, they will. Finally, Parker Sidnor was my great-grandfather. Why do I want to share this with the nation? Parker Robert Sidnor and Betsy Burwell Sidnor were my great-grandparents. Next slide, please. Now, we're going into this area of criteria. This is actually in the nomination. What is the historical significance? What are those historical periods? When we look at this log cabin, we see that it was active, it was alive, not only in the 19th century for African Americans, but moving into the 20th century as well. Very quickly, I wanted to share with you, 1888 was a very significant date. Vicey Skipwith, African American woman, was the woman that we identified who first owned the property, 6 acres of the log cabin property that was originally a part of Crestwood Plantation. So that becomes significant in and of itself. And if you are interested, I can send you more information on Vicey Skipwith and her relationship to the property. Architect, unknown. This is what's listed on the national, on the nomination. But we know that enslaved African Americans from Crestwood Plantation built the log cabin. We have the areas of significance, the social history, ethnic heritage, the architecture, as well as in 2012, the site is listed on the Historic American Buildings Survey at the Library of Congress. Moving to the applicable National Register criteria. The property, this is very significant. How do we come to this point of saying, yes, the property is associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history? And our history is that of slavery, the Civil War, emancipation, Reconstruction, the era of Jim Crow and legal segregation, as well as the Civil Rights Movement. The property is associated with the lives of persons significant during that period of history. And here we have Parker Sidnor. The property embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, the log cabin. Next slide, please. Do we have the next slide, please?
Do you not see the next slide, Angelita?
All right, thank you. Got it. Thank you.
Sorry.
Non-traditional archival resources. Here, I've simply gone through a list of many of the resources that we used, but then some were more significant than others, and some may not be relevant for certain properties that are being researched in the African American context. For us, the African American church cemeteries were of primary importance because we wanted to identify those tombstones that Parker Sidnor carved. We have church records, the obituaries, HBCUs, photographs. Photographs are wonderful if you can get those historical photographs. African American business records, and finally, military records. People. As John has indicated, we have the Virginia Department of Historical Resources, fantastic. We had the state architectural historian who came down to the property, and she actually wrote up the architectural description of the property, all the details, all the formal, excellent that we were able to use and incorporate into the nomination. Now, here is where we go back to that kitchen table, the descendant community members who will provide those oral histories and formal interviews. We have the obituaries. When did people die? Where did they die? Who were they related to? And now, the point that I want to make here, very important point, is that we're collaborating the typical and atypical sources to bring this nomination to success. Neither is mutually exclusive of the other. So we have federal, state, and local. The Library of Congress has a wealth of information and assistance, especially with photographs, especially if you want photographs from certain historical periods. And they do have photographs of various areas of African American history and culture. We have the Freedmen's Bureau records. They're digitized already. And I just want to make a point, also connecting to what John said. When I did this research, many of the records that I used, they were not digitized yet. This is only in 2007. They were not yet digitized. So I had to go and physically go to the Library of Virginia or to the courthouse in Boyden, which was good. It was good, a very good experience. And of course, we have these census records that are invaluable. Next slide, please. Photographs. These are photographs of some of the individuals whose families lived in the log cabin. I'm in communications now with certain families whose descendants have heard about our project and they want to be a part of it. And they provided some of these photographs that they said, our grandmothers, our great-grandmother, our great-great-grandmother lived in the log cabin. And so we move forward into 2015 and we see Umu Thomas, who is the 5th great-granddaughter of Parker Sidnor. She was in middle school in 2015. or moving into high school, graduating into high school, and now she is a doctoral student in pharmacology. She's working on a doctorate in pharmacology. And when she came to be among us at the ceremony, you know, I really just got chills because this is the legacy. This is what we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Next slide, please. Storytelling from oral history. It will, even if you do not have the significant person connected to your structure, storytelling will enhance your nomination. And I would like to share a quote with you from Elsa Barkley Brown. Like any good historian, my mother looked at the people's words and their actions, public and private. She analyzed them and preserved them. And in fact, she taught both the facts and the form of analysis in her class, even if it had only one pupil, her daughter. And if this resonated with me as I spoke to my own mother, my own grandmother, my aunts, my great uncles, who were a part of that storytelling oral history. Next slide, please. So this is creating placemaking. Oral history becomes another kind of archive at the kitchen table. Now, I want to quickly tell you a story that collaborates the non-traditional source with the traditional typical source. They interact. Neither is mutually exclusive of the other. Aunt Lucinda, I was told for many years by informants in the oral history context that this log cabin was owned by Aunt Lucinda. Aunt Lucinda had been born enslaved at Presswood Plantation, and actually she was a twin. I could not, the twin must have died early. But Aunt Lucinda was born enslaved. She lived to be about 102 years old in Clarksville, Virginia. Now, I could not find Aunt Lucinda Fuller's name on any aspect of the log cabin property. I could only find Vicey Skipwith's name as the first African-American woman who purchased the property from Presswood Plantation. With more work being the history detective, I finally found out Full War Skipwith gave the log cabin to Aunt Lucinda before emancipation, but he did not give her the property. She never owned the log cabin property. She owned the cabin because she had been enslaved, and he gave it to her as a gift. So this is where we intersect with the oral history and with the typical source, the documented source. Neither is mutually exclusive of the other. That story about Aunt Lucinda, it's very important. Next slide, please. How do you maximize your research, your investigation, your preparation? You could, maybe it's a possibility that you're going to collaborate and intersect the non-traditional with the typical resources. We have the buildings and the people, and this creates placemaking and inclusive practices for historic preservation. Next slide, please. Think big, start small, learn fast. Next slide, please. What we started out doing is in 2013, we had Virginia Tech Community Design Assistance Center. The team came down to Clarksville, Virginia, and they created the architectural design concept for the Sydnor Historic Site. This is for the future. What we want to have this site open up to the public as a history heritage center, a gathering place, not only for the descendant communities, for Black and white communities, for all of us who are using constructive resilience to move us forward. So here we have the design team. They did the concept. This was sponsored by Literacy Interactive, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Next slide, please. And here's an image of the site that we envision for the future, that a gathering place for everyone to come to. Next slide. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we've come to the end of our presentations. And so we'll start the Q&A section of the webinar. Please place your questions in the chat if you have any. We have a few, and I'll start with the first one, and I'll direct this question to Maral. And this is from William Wright, and he wants to know how to access 1930s aerial photos.
It is through the Department of Agriculture. They're available online. The Library of Congress also has them if you go to their Maryland location. But if I'm sorry, I will get that and tell you exactly what to search from. I believe it is in the, it's listed, the link is listed in DHR's booklet, How to Research Your Historic Virginia Property. It is in there. That's where I'm looking now, but I would direct him to look there and it'll give him the link.
Okay, Sonia, can you find that link and place it in the chat? And
Yes,
okay, and the next question is for Dr. Reyes. Can you tell us what family letters are? When you said family letters, what were you referring to?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. I connected that with obituaries. I just found out what quote unquote a family letter is last year during the pandemic. A family letter is a kind of obituary that African Americans had in their communities. When someone died, and this was before photocopying, Xeroxing, or any type of making copies of letters and whatever, when someone died, someone in the African American community would write the person's obituary, but it was in the form of a letter. And usually it would be one page because ink was scarce, paper, and it's all written out. Now, no photocopy. So that individual would maybe write that letter 5, 6 times. The same letter, they would repeat and write it, and they would give it to members of the family. What was also interesting about the family letter as an obituary is that usually in these early African American communities, let's say the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, there were very few people in the community who were literate, who could read and write. So the person who wrote the family letter as an obituary was a kind of scribe. Now, since I found out about this, as I said, just last year, I went online trying to find family letter. That is such a generic term. You do not come up with the meaning that I have just given to you. But does this exist? Yes, it exists. Recently, maybe in December, I happened to be looking at a photo album of my son-in-law. My son-in-law is from California. And it's a photo album. I'm just flipping through it. And all of a sudden, I come across a letter. And I read, happened to look at the letter. It is exactly what was described to me, a family letter, the obituary, dated 1945, handwritten. And it was exactly as was described. It was the kind of obituary for someone who had died at that time. I was so excited when I saw this, because if I had seen that 2 years ago, I would have ignored it. I would not have known what it is. So if anyone has any more information on the family letter, or even has one in your possession, I would love for you to share that with me. I can be reached at info@literacyinteractives.org. So that is my excitement about a new kind of non-traditional historical document.
Okay. The next question is Family Search the best site for genealogical research? And I can answer that one. Most people would say it is the best because it is free 99 all day. So it is free, it will always be free. And we know that there is a fee for Ancestry.com, actually an additional fee if you're going to be doing international research. For me, Family Search, it's just been easier for me to find things. I don't know if it's the algorithm, that's used or what it is, but most of the times I can, even if there's a misspelling, I'm usually able to pull things up on Family Search rather fast. Family Search also helps you to build your tree faster as well. It's not too many like kinks in there where, just a lot of, barriers that you have to, hump over just to enter your information. Also, they have over 300,000 digital books. These are things that Ancestry doesn't have. Now, with Ancestry, Ancestry does have a large genealogical database. So it is easier for you to, if you're looking for cousins and things like that. But different people use them for, different things. I use them both, at the same time, but if I had to choose, I would definitely prefer Family Search. And we have another question here. And this is from Tamara Monarino. I don't want to mispronounce your name, but the question is, how do you know when research is finished and your nomination is ready to submit? And so I'll pass that to John Salmon.
Okay, well, my theory is that research doesn't answer questions, it only leads to more questions. But eventually you got to quit and declare enough. I think one way is work with someone at the Department of Historic Resources to review your work, and also pay close attention to what do I say? I think Bulletin 16, if it's still called that, which is basically how to write a National Register nomination, is a great guide. It's put out by the National Park Service. You can go to their website and download whatever it is they're calling it now. We just, back in the day, we knew it by Bulletin 16B actually. But the nomination isn't meant to be, but it sometimes turns into something like a doctoral dissertation. It just goes on and on and on. But basically you want to, they used to be painfully short back in the late 1960s, like the White House National Historic Landmark nomination was 2 pages, which is ridiculous. Now they go on and on, but when you feel that you've answered the questions about significance of the property, why is it important? What is important with regard to the people who live there in terms of their accomplishments and who built the house and so forth? You probably answered and traced it back to when it was actually built. you probably answered many of the questions if it's just being nominated under architecture. If it's being nominated under history, it depends on what aspect of history is important to it. Could be Civil War related. Maybe there was a battle there. It served as a headquarters during a battle or something like that. But I, try to cover it in 4 or 5 pages, and as I say, work with the Department of Historic Resources staff in your area and get their opinions on it, and they'll let you know when enough is enough.
Okay. Alice Cannon wants to know, has anyone found a way to access agricultural censuses other than those available on Ancestry? She says she's tried the Census Bureau and no one seems to know where they are stored. And so I'll defer this one to Maral.
I don't know the answer to that question. I recall that I found when I was doing research in the late 80s, early 1990s, I found lots of the agricultural census at the library at UVA in the stacks. And they have like the compendium, which is a summary of everything, but they also had different localities, individual, agricultural census books. So I don't know if those are still there. They weren't even in special collections. And but I've been using them, online or in microfilm, before looking at them online, that are stored usually at local archives. They will have those. But I don't know, other than my experience where I found some Clark County ones all the way down in Charlottesville. But again, that was a while back. Maybe John would know the answer to that question.
I was
I'm
wondering,
afraid I don't know.
I was wondering, are they digitized online?
Yes, they are digitized.
Through the
I
library?
think she's asking.
Access them through Ancestry.
She's asking the actual. Yeah, you can get them on Ancestry now, but I think she's asking. She wants to see the real thing.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I would be interested in if online, but is it only through Ancestry online?
No, I think they're on Family Search also.
Okay.
They're really interesting and they're really long ledgers. So the page goes, and it's usually continued beneath it, talking about all the different products.
Okay.
And maybe the USDA, they may have them. That might be a good place to look. I'm not really familiar. I've just always accessed them through Ancestry or Family Search. That's a good question. That's something for me to look into.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time tonight, and I want to thank all of our panelists. It's been a fascinating evening. I've got notes that I need to review so I can just catch up with all the things I'm thinking about. This, as our other recordings, will be posted on the Department of Historic Resources website, as well as Preservation Virginia's in the coming days. But I want to thank everybody for their participation. And I want to thank all of our viewers that came in and asked such super great questions. Mark your calendar for next Wednesday, when we will explore how to hire a consultant for your preservation project. Maybe the second most asked question that we receive at Preservation Virginia. So thank you again, and I hope everybody enjoys their evening. Bye.